Hello and welcome to this month's edition of Missouri Legislative Update. Reporting from the upper gallery of the Missouri Senate Chamber, I'm Jennifer Yapel.
And I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives. Following a legislative spring break, the Missouri House put its stamp of approval on its version of the state's 2015 operating budget. Supporters of the budget point to increases in education funding, while opponents claim the budget doesn't do enough for the state.
John from Montauk.
The Missouri House put its stamp of approval on the 13 appropriation bills making up the state's operating budget. The $26.6 billion budget covers the state's operating expenses for fiscal year 2015. The House's budget calls for an increase of more than $120 million to the state's education foundation formula.
I think that's extremely important to show that we were serious about trying to improve education across the state, but especially with the earmarking in the areas dedicated to the schools that are struggling.
The House's budget calls for an additional $156 million for the foundation formula, but only if revenue exceeds the House's current projection. However, not everyone supports the tiered funding approach. Some claim the stinginess of the majority could cost students across the state.
It means that money will not be available for this school year. You cannot budget for something you don't know that you will receive. Underestimating means that Missouri school districts will plan less and will achieve less.
Democrats attempted to include Medicaid expansion into the House's budget, but it failed along a party line vote. The budget also calls for a 1% cut to the state's workforce. In addition, it provides a 1% pay raise to state employees and provides more than $55 million worth of additional benefits.
That money is for their health care system. That money is there for their retirement system. So we are basically fully funding those systems to a point where they don't have to pay more out of their own pocket each year for health care and retirement.
The 13 budget bills now head to the Missouri Senate for consideration. The state's constitution requires all 13 budget bills to be on the governor's desk by May 9th at 6 p.m.
Before the budget even reached the Missouri Senate, lawmakers concluded the first half of the 2014 legislative session by delivering 5 Senate bills to the governor for his signature. A legislative package sponsored by Senator Brad Lager of Savannah is one of the first bills to reach the governor this year and will establish a statewide process for telecommunication companies to make infrastructure repairs and improvements. The bills were signed in mid-March. Senate Bill 668, sponsored by Senator Ryan Silvey of Kansas City, also received the governor's signature in mid-March and will require health insurance plans to establish equal out-of-pocket costs for covered oral and intravenously administered chemotherapy medications.
This is a solution that makes sense. Mr. President, I think it's time for Missouri to join the other 27 states in solving this problem.
Legislation addressing funding for public higher education institutions and a measure tackling school accreditation and student transfers, which we'll learn more about later in the show, have advanced to the House for its consideration. Both bills are sponsored by Senator David Pierce of Warrensburg. Measures relating to the rights of gun owners in Missouri also moved to the House. Senate Bill 613 is sponsored by Senator Brian Nieves of Washington, and Senate Joint Resolution 36 is sponsored by Senator Kurt Schaefer of Columbia. Senate Bill 667, sponsored by Senator Eric Schmidt of Glendale, would change Missouri's gubernatorial appointment process for acting directors and members of state boards and commissions.
When these vacancies come up, they're actually on an expired term. They are a vacancy that needs to be filled. It can be the same person that's reappointed or somebody new, but you don't want to have a 3-year term turn into an 8-year term. It also deals with the time frame to appoint new directors once someone has left that position.
Senate Bill 530, sponsored by Senator Doug Leibla of Poplar Bluff, would allow drug use or convictions to be used in determining the parental fitness in proceedings regarding the termination of parental rights.
It is obvious, and evidence proves, that our children deserve to move faster through the permanency process and placed for adoption. After all, children have rights too.
Senate Bill 532, sponsored by Senator Jamila Nasheed of St. Louis, would change state law regarding the educational and medical consent provided by relative caregivers.
Right now, caregivers, they don't have the right to go and take care of the educational needs or the medical needs of the child that they are taking care of. And so basically what this bill would allow for those caregivers to do is to sign an affidavit, and that way they can take care of the children's needs.
Other Senate bills under consideration in the House include Senate Bill 510, sponsored by Senator Will Kraus of Lee Summit, which would redefine the terms misconduct and good cause when determining disqualification from unemployment benefits. Senate Bill 567, sponsored by Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal of University City, which would make changes to adult daycare programs in Missouri. And Senate Bill 639, sponsored by Senator Dan Brown of Rolla, which would require facilities to share with patients their mammography results that show they have dense breast tissue, which might hide abnormalities that could further be examined by supplemental screening. To follow these and other bills through the legislative process, visit senate.mo.gov.
The Missouri House of Representatives sent legislation to the Missouri Senate aiming to limit the amount of damage recoverable from a medical malpractice lawsuit. In this next story, we take a look at how lawmakers hope the legislation will have a big picture impact on the state.
And they see the doctor that they have sued.
The Missouri House sent legislation to the Missouri Senate intended to protect medical professionals from excessive lawsuits. House Bill 1173 aims to cap the amount of money an individual can receive from a medical malpractice lawsuit. The proposal caps the non-economic damages one can receive at $350,000. Without the caps, supporters feel these lawsuits could drive doctors out of the state.
Doctors in my community are retiring. I had an OBGYN say, these caps are gone. I'm going to pay all of my what I would take home are going to go to pay for the premiums. I'm closing shop. There's no reason to keep the lights on anymore.
In 2005, the Missouri General Assembly passed legislation capping non-economic damages in medical malpractice cases. But in 2012, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled the limits unconstitutional.
We sit here every day and we talk about constitutional rights. This is eroding our right to trial by jury, and that's very important. Our Constitution is funded on this fundamental right to trial by jury.
Lawmakers passed the proposal by a 94-61 vote. It now heads to the Missouri Senate for consideration.
Legislation relating to how Missouri schools are accredited and how students can transfer out of failing school districts was recently approved by the Senate. Senate Communications correspondent Brad Bayshore has more on the journey of Senate Bill 493 to the House.
Madam Secretary, please read the bills and call the roll.
After weeks of committee hearings and multiple hours of debate on the Senate floor, senators passed Senate Bill 493, sponsored by Senate Education Chairman David Pierce of Warrensburg. The measure is a compromise between 9 different Senate bills, which, among other provisions, aim to modify laws relating to school accreditation and student transfers. The need to address the overwhelming cost of the state's current school transfer laws was a motivating factor for the ultimate passage of the bill.
But it's been a very dramatic situation throughout the St. Louis metropolitan area. And it's likely to get worse if we don't address it.
We've had this discussion for a very, very, very long time. These discussions are things that we've been having even over the last few years here at the state. And it's time that something be done.
During debate, over 20 amendments dealing with elementary and secondary education were considered by the Senate. Senator Jason Holzman of Kansas City says he is against the bill because it does not address why some school districts are failing.
And that is the jobless rate in the urban core, that is nutrition, that is domestic violence, that is the transient nature of families, that is the socioeconomic conditions by which our citizens live in, which inhibits their success.
The act would later pass by a vote of 27-5, sending the measure to the House for similar consideration. Several senators, including the bill's sponsor, were proud of the bipartisan efforts to pass the legislation in the Senate.
If we wait until everybody's happy, we'll never pass legislation in this body. And yet it's important for us to realize that we can compromise for the good of the state of Missouri, and I think that's what we've exhibited here this week.
Reporting for the Missouri Senate, I'm Brad Bayshore.
After the break, veteran Capitol reporter Bob Priddy sits down with Senator Brad Lager to discuss the first half of the 2014 legislative session. That and more up next on Missouri Legislative Update.
In 1977, an 8-year-old boy picked up the game of golf from his father. The odds of that same boy then making it to the US and European Pro Golf Tours, 1 in 7 million. The odds of the Big Easy winning the US Open twice, 1 in 1.2 billion. The odds of him having a child diagnosed with autism, 1 in 88. Ernie Els encourages you to learn the signs of autism.
Welcome to Capitol Dialogue. I'm Bob Priddy from the Missourinet. We're glad to have you with us as we take a look at what's going on in the state capitol during this legislative session. We're at the midpoint of the session, so we're going to talk a little bit about where we've been and where we have to go. The answer to the latter question is a long ways. Where we've been, well, we're going to talk about that with Senator Brad Lager, who's from Savannah up in northwest Missouri. You've been in the legislature now for 16 years?
12 years.
12. 4 in the House and 8 over here in the Senate.
4 in the House, 8 in the Senate.
And this is going to be it for you. This is your last.
I am on the final stretch here.
Well, are you happy to be about done, or I guess you probably have some mixed feelings?
You know, after 12 years of public service, I am very grateful for that opportunity. But you know, when I came in, Bob, I was 26 years old. I was single. It was a great opportunity. But you know, now my wife and I have 2 young kids, and I want to be part of their lives. And this job's tough. It's tough to do that. And so for me, it's. I also have a pretty strong feeling that our founding fathers actually set up this form of government where we would come and serve, but ultimately we would go back to the private sector. And so I'm ready to go back to the private sector.
But have you had any folks back home say, gee, I wish I could vote for you for another term?
You always have that, and it always makes you feel good and you're grateful for it. But at the end of the day, I actually believe in term limits. And we could talk about, do we need to change them a little bit? Do we need to tweak here, tweak there? But at the end of the day, new blood, fresh ideas, I believe those are good things in this building.
Well, that is one of the constants, it seems, during your 12 years here. People are always wanting to tinker with term limits somehow, to adjust them in some way. Do you ever foresee a time that term limits would be changed? Would the voters ever go for any kind of a change?
You know, I think that the voters may go for a change if you were actually reducing the time. So right now it's 8 in the House and 8 in the Senate. I think that you may be able to do something like 12 years total, but in either body. You know, all in the Senate, all in the House, mixture of both. That might have a chance. But I think that if you try to just expand it to 16 years in either chamber, I'm not sure the voters agree that that's the way we need to go.
So as you look down this tunnel and you see this light getting ever bigger, this legislative session, and we're halfway through the session now, where do you think we've come since January to the middle of March as you go on spring break?
You know, this year has definitely been slower than most. For all practical purposes, the only bills laying on the governor's desk right now are 5 telecom bills. They were bills that were all one large package last year that was ultimately sued on for Hammersmith. So they were really bills that we'd already passed once, and so they made it through the process quickly. Outside of that, you know, there hasn't been a lot of movement, and part of it is because of the magnitude of the stuff we're working on, whether it's the criminal code rewrite, which, you know, that's the bill we're on right now. It's 1,100 pages. That's going to take a while. You know, there's some folks that are pushing for growing our social programs. Well, there are a lot of us that lived through scaling those back in 2005, and we're very reluctant to go down that road again. And then we got the issues of tax cuts. You know, we've passed the tax cuts. The governor's vetoed the tax cuts. We didn't have the votes on the override. So we have a lot of stuff stacking up that none of it's easy. And I just think because of that, it's going to take more time.
Let's talk about the tax cuts for a minute, because here in the Senate, there have been 3 days of discussions of a tax cut bill, which seems to morph from day to day, and the sponsor has not been able to get a vote on it because there seem to be divisions within especially the Republican Party on which direction the state should be going in terms of tax policy. How do you see that shaking out? Or do you think that this is one of these things that's just too complicated to really come up with something firm by the middle of May?
I'm not sure that it shakes out. You know, there are these two different thoughts here. The one is you do whatever tax plan you have to do to get the governor to sign it. That means probably at least a portion of it being tax cuts for people. probably less for business. The other side of this thought process is that you want to cut taxes that are going to grow the economy and create the greatest level of investment. And that side of the argument is more on the you cut more for business and less for people. And as you said, we've not been able to come to a balance on where that is yet. So can we get there by May? You know, we probably can. Can I tell you today exactly what that's going to be for sure? Man, I think your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, there are an awful lot of elements that go into any kind of tax cut bills, but this balance that he's talking about is one that's very difficult to achieve, just because everybody in the Senate, as you like to say, everybody's a senator, and it seems like everybody has their own angle on this particular issue this year.
Yeah, you know, I've always said one of the neat things about our Senate and the way that our Senate works, and you can at times argue that it's dysfunctional, it's not working the way you want it to, you're a victim of it, or you use the process at times, but really it's a raging river with 34 islands. And you know, if you can navigate through 34 islands, you're going to probably have an end result that's pretty decent.
It seems though this year though that the Senate has been fairly harmonious, except on a few real hot button issues.
Yep, that's right. I tell you, Bob, this is my, as you said, this is my 8th year here. And in terms of the members of the Senate getting along and legitimately wanting to sit down and try to work through issues, this is the best I've ever seen the Senate work. Now, is it perfect? Boy, it's not. But the Senate is that place where you take differing opinions, ideas, philosophical, feelings, and you figure out how to put those as close to each other as you can to forge some point of compromise where you can get something done that's actually right for the people without giving up what you're here to fight for.
In the last several years, there has been, it seems to me, a rise in legislation that tries to set Missouri apart from various federal laws, rules, or regulations. Where does that come from, and where are we, and how big an issue is it for people like you in the legislature?
You know, what we have seen in the last, 5 to 8 years is we've seen the federal government begin to reach further than they've ever reached before. And it's not all one party, it's happened under both parties. But the reality is the federal government is continuing to encroach on personal freedoms. And as individual people, it's really hard to fight back against that. And I think that this growth in that movement that you talked about is really the states saying, wait a minute, we've had enough. And we are going to push back. And we're going to debate whether this is legal or not legal. We'll see in court. The federal government, our founding fathers envisioned a very limited role for a centralized government, and we believe it should stay that way. And every time that you try to take that next step, you try to encroach on us more, we're going to push back. And that's what I think is really driving it.
But are not many of these bills, as they like to say, lawyers' full employment opportunity bills?
There's no doubt that lawyers continue to make out better and better every time we do these kind of things.
Since the start of the year, we've had several executions. The death penalty has come up in conversation a few times already. There are some bills that are being heard. Do you see any change being made in the death penalty law in the state of Missouri anytime this year or next?
I do not. I mean, at the end of the day, there's often the argument of, well, it's very costly. This isn't about cost. This is about deterrence. Deterrence, when bad people do bad things, there are consequences for their actions.
You have seen lean times, you've seen flush times. Now we're a little bit better off than we were, as you mentioned, in 2005. Is there a bigger fight over money when you have more of it than there is when there's not a lot?
It is way more difficult to govern when we have a lot of money than when we have little money. When it's little money, everyone knows you need to hunker down and work it out and figure out how you're going to make pennies balance. When we are flush with money, everyone has their pet project to spend on, and it's pretty hard to keep all the cats in the wheelbarrow. I mean, it's just, it's the one thing I never anticipated, Bob, is when we have a little bit of money, everybody wants to spend.
What do you think Brad Lager's legacy is going to be in the Senate?
I hope that when it's all said and done, I came into a Senate that was very controversial, very contentious, and could get nothing done. And I hope that as I leave, one of the things that I've spent the last 4 years really working on is how to put processes in place here to make sure that we as individual senators are able to work together to get something decent done for the people that we serve. And that is what I hope it ends up being.
After the break, Bob Priddy sits down with the House's top Democrat to get the other side of the story. That's up next on Missouri Legislative Update.
The odds of becoming a successful NASCAR driver, 1 in 125 billion. The odds of a child being diagnosed with autism, 1 in 88. I'm Jamie McMurray. Learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs.
Our second guest on Capitol Dialogue today is Jake Hummel. He's a state representative. He's from St. Louis, and he is the minority floor leader of the Missouri House. Being the minority floor leader of the Missouri House and being outnumbered 2-1 must leave you sometimes at the end of the day thinking, what am I here for? Tell me about being a minority floor leader in a House where you're outnumbered by that big a margin.
Well, it's we do feel that way occasionally. I won't pretend that we don't, but we try to stay relevant. At the end of the day, every one of my members represents 37,000 constituents, just like the members of the majority. They're here to make their voices heard for their constituents, the same as the majority is, and that's what we tell our people, that always remember that your voice has to be heard, that you need to be up at that microphone, you need to make sure you're speaking for your constituents, and I think that helps get us through the day.
Are minority Democrats in the House of Representatives being heard, you think, in the legislature this year?
We try. Does it fall on deaf ears? A lot of the times, yes, absolutely. When you look at some of the bigger things, look at what happened with the Boeing bill. Depending on what side of the aisle you fell on, it didn't really matter. Everyone was together. It was a lockstep. Job creation. Everybody got together and said, we think this is the best thing for Missouri, and we're really grateful when we're able to work with both sides to come to some kind of agreement with that. And we try to be heard. We are silenced on occasion, but this year's been a little better than the past year, so we're glad for that.
We're halfway through this legislative session. Where do you think the Republicans and Democrats in the House have been most able to work effectively together? And where do you think at the midway point of this session the Republicans and Democrats in the House have been the farthest apart?
Well, to date, the legislature's been very slow. There hasn't been a lot of movement on things. As far as working together on issues, I think there was some bipartisan support for some of the utility legislation that came through that was kicked out by the courts. We would really much like to work with the majority on Medicaid expansion. Unfortunately, it seems like we are the farthest apart on those issues, but I see some light at the end of the tunnel. I think that there's ways that we can move towards some reforms that we would be comfortable with in order to get that across the goal line, and we're very willing to talk about that. I guess maybe labor issues are something that's something that we're pretty far apart on, but I think there's bipartisan support on both sides for against some of those issues. So it's kind of a mix.
Labor has been traditionally one of the dividing lines between the Republicans and Democrats in the House of in this House as well as in the Senate too.
Sure.
Do you ever see the two sides able to agree on something having to do with labor issues?
Probably not.
Okay, just from the standpoint of right to work.
Right to work, I think, paycheck, some of the other things, prevailing wage, those three things seem to be always the key sticking points. And, I don't know any Democrats in the House that would ever vote for any of those three things. I think that's some of those issues that we know are at our core are what gives us strength and the people that we represent.
Abortion is one of those issues that often seems to fall along partisan lines, but really when you look at some of the votes on some abortion bills through the years, they've crossed party lines. That's one of these issues that sometimes doesn't fit the partisan split, does it?
And we see that in the House every day. We're Democrats. We have a very big tent. We don't tell our people to vote one way or another. We certainly, when we come to some core issues, we fall more to one side or another, but we don't force our people to vote a certain way, as seems to be the case on the other side of the aisle. And so we have members that represent rural districts and people that are on both sides of that, and that's fine. That's fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and we're not going to punish anyone for voting their district.
Now, you mentioned Medicaid. Medicaid is another one of those divisive issues. Now, one side talks about reforms, another side talks about expansion. Do you see any way that you can find some kind of middle ground on either or both of these issues before the middle of May?
I hope so, and we are absolutely willing to talk about reforms if they're willing to talk about expansion. I will not say that there is any way that we will not talk about that. We are very willing to come to the table. We're willing to work out some form of compromise. As of today, I believe the number was $359 million that we've left on the table as of today, almost $360 million. This is our money that's being sent up to Washington that we're not getting back. Enough's enough. It's time for us to get this passed, give health insurance to 300,000 working Missourians, and create 24,000 jobs in the process.
In fact, down in the hallway, a floor below us, or maybe 2 floors below us, there's a sign outside a representative's office that daily updates how many $1 million the state has lost. What do you hope to gain by that sign?
I think it's just a reminder. I can't speak for that representative, but I know where he's coming from, and I think Representative Favor posted that, and he wants everyone to be informed of how much of our tax dollars we're letting some other state have. By April, it's going to be $500 million that we've turned away. That's a sizable investment to this state to get some of our constituents' money back, to reinvest here. I hope he continues with the sign.
What's going on in the House on taxes? Tax cuts, tax credit reform. Where are you halfway through the session?
As far as the tax cuts that are proposed, it doesn't seem like the majority has a focused idea of what they want. If you look at what happens in the Senate, what are the bills in the Senate as opposed to the ones in the House, they're actually all over the place. There's no consistent message. I think the only message that they're sending is any tax cut must be a good one, no matter where it's focused. And we don't feel that way, of course. We're not against some form of tax cut as long as it is, as long as we can fully fund our schools first. That's the #1 priority for us. The foundation formula was established under Republican governor, Republican House, Republican Senate 6 years ago, or in 2006 rather, pardon me, and it has still never been fully funded. And I think it's time that we live up to that promise and fund our public schools.
How much short is the foundation now?
$600 million this year.
$600 million.
Now that's per year.
And
underfunded.
Is there any way the state can afford to just throw $600 million into that foundation formula now?
Well, first of all, I don't feel like it's just throwing the money there. We're required to fund our public schools. I think that should be our first priority. We can't make it all up this year. I think there's ways we can. I think the governor's budget proposal is the first step. Get us halfway this year and hopefully the other half next year if the economy improves. But we've got to start working towards that goal.
And that's our show for this month. If you have any questions regarding anything going on in the Missouri House, you can visit our website at house.mo.gov. I'm Jonathan Lorenz reporting for the Missouri House of Representatives.
And if you have any questions about the legislation that appeared in this program, please visit our website at senate.mo.gov. I'm Jennifer Yapel reporting for the Missouri Senate. We leave you this month with some of the highlights of the Mizzou football team's visit to the state capitol in March, where lawmakers celebrated their accomplishments from last season.
Very, very proud of what we do with our players and the successes that they've had. Academically, we've graduated our players at a very, very high level. Obviously, in the last 7 years, we're the 8th winningest BCS program in the nation. And we also develop young men. That's our responsibility to do that. But we've got great kids, great players, work so hard. People have no idea the amount of time they put in to be successful. I'm very proud to be the head football coach at the University of Missouri, and will continue to work as hard as I can to graduate our players and win a lot of football games. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.